Hello.
Hello, welcome to today's event, which we are calling What Were You Thinking? A neuroscientist explanation of teenage decision making. My name is Ann Merchant. We are very glad that you are here with us today. And of course, I would be incapable of introducing an event without my Wednesday afternoon event partner.
I'm Rick Lovert, Program Director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a program of the National Academy of Sciences. And Ann, I just don't believe that at all.
It's true. Well, let's not put it to the test. How about that?
Mm.
Okay. All right. So, for those of you who have had, will have, or currently have teenagers in your lives, I think that you'll probably find that today's conversation will provide you with new insight into a topic that's often feels like a mystery. My son is long past teenage years, but I often did feel like I had no idea what he was thinking. So, I imagine that today's event will often feel like a little bit of therapy for some of us. The Academy's portfolio of work on this topic is really grounded in the 2019 report, The Promise of Adolescence, which really calls out the many ways in which we can create opportunities for adolescents rather than simply, as the report says, myopically focus on containing risks. Considering the fact that adolescents account for about 1/4 of the US population, it's a demographic that we should be paying attention to. And I certainly think that adolescents make up a good portion of the characters that we see on screen, both in film and television. Why this is, of course, a topic that is of interest to the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
That's right. Adolescent is a confusing time to live through and sometimes equally nonsensical to understand as an adult looking backwards. So, if you are a storyteller, you have questions about adolescence and the adolescent brain as you're making a feature film, TV show, or video game, please do give us a call. We can connect you with field experts like Adriana, who you will meet in just a minute. We have done over 3,300 consults since we opened our doors over 12 years ago. And by the way, if you are a STEM professional and you're interested in getting involved in these consults, please reach out. We're always looking for volunteers to connect to storytellers. I have to thank today Howard Hughes Medical Institute for generously furnishing the budget for this event and all of our live events. We also get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and many individual donors like you. Thank you for those of you who joined today at the supporter level. We will be sending you one of these as well as access to VIP Q&As. There will not be a VIP Q&A today. We are sorry about that, but we try to do them as often as we can. If at any time during the conversation today, you have a question for either Jon or Adriana, you can put it right down here or right up here, depending on what device you're using. And I will be editing and farming out those questions and forwarding them to Jon. If we don't get to your question, we're very sorry. It's completely my fault. I am the one who picks out the questions and tries to condense them to pass along to Jon. So that is not on him, it's on me. I want to thank Ameche, Courtney, Jeff, and Sachi for your help in making this event possible. We couldn't do it without you. And also, each week we do a rabbit hole. This is something that as we were researching the event, we stumbled across that totally derailed everything we were doing for like a period of time that we don't care to admit. But this week for me, I found a Washington Post article about the right to be forgotten, which seems to me like a brilliant idea. This is the idea that once you've passed your teenage years and you're in adulthood, you should have the right to delete all of those terrible teenage posts that you put up. It turns out 36% of college admissions officers say that they look at social media profiles when trying to evaluate a candidate. And 58% of those people say that they left with a negative impression of the candidate after they looked. So that's my rabbit hole for this week.
Yeah, that sounds terrible. I am so glad that neither I nor my son actually had to think about social media when applying for colleges. And my rabbit hole is actually the National 4-H Club. I've had some professional association with them, and one of the things they say is we're not just plows and cows. And they have had more than 6 million kids go through their programs, and it's really about creating community for young people and giving them a voice in how they think about their things like health equities in their communities and how they connect with mentors. And it's run through public universities, and it's a really interesting program. There's a ton of STEM opportunities. So even it's not just about whether you live in, the heartland of America and have farm animals. So I would encourage anybody to check out, particularly as we're approaching summer, the National 4-H Club. It's a really interesting program. So that's my rabbit hole. And I also do want to thank our colleagues at the Division on Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education at the academies, because they also are in large part behind the scenes, a real part of this event, and have helped us put this together. So we're very appreciative of their support and their, as I say, behind the scenes work to help us put together. And we got really lucky. I think we've been saying to both Adriana and to Jon that we felt like we hit the lottery when they were both available on the same day at the same time to do this event. And it's no coincidence that we went to the two of them. I mean, certainly Adriana is the go-to when you want to have a conversation on this topic. But it turns out, of course, that we were thinking back, and both Adriana and Jon had been at one of the Science and Entertainment Exchange retreats, which is a very small gathering of the members of the creative community and scientists. And we put them together to work on creative exercises, but to also talk about a lot of different science. And Jon and Adriana had been part of the same retreat and had done some of those creative exercises together. So we thought this would be a great way to bring them back together. And Jon is just such an insanely curious person. We knew he would have lots of questions for her. So we would like to invite Adriana and Jon to join us on screen. And actually then Rick and I will run away and give the floor to the two of them to carry on from here.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, and thank you so much.
Hi,
hello
Jon.
again, Adriana. Hello.
Hi, thank you.
So, I feel deeply qualified to talk to you about this topic because, amazingly, I was an adolescent.
I know.
And I do wonder frequently, what was I thinking? More seriously, I'm the father of 4 sons. And so, and 2 of them are still adolescents. So I'm profoundly interested in everything that you're talking about. And so, which is a perfect segue to say, what exactly are you talking about? Well, tell us seriously, what you do and why you do it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we're talking about when you talk about adolescence is change. Rick and Anne pulled out some adjectives about how it's a confusing time, a nonsensical time, an awkward time, and those things are true, but it's also a time that's really fun, it's thrilling, it's exciting, it's full of hope. And what we're talking about is the change and the transition period between being a kid who is heavily dependent on others and caregivers to an adult who is increasingly less dependent on caregivers. And so adolescence is typically defined between the ages of 10 and 24. And we're in my work, and all my colleagues around the world who study adolescence are trying to understand, how does the brain support this normative time of development when we're supposed to be having a lot of fun and a lot of questions and a lot of confusing times?
So talk to me, let's start with the sort of neuroscience of it. And then I'd love to sort of move on to some of the huge social implications of your work, including, addiction, crime, behavior in social media and that Rick talked about. But talk to me first about how you approach adolescence as a neuroscientist.
Yeah. So we know that the brain doesn't stop growing early in life. So decades ago, we thought that the brain stopped developing around, 2, 3, 4. But we now know that even though the size of the brain probably stops growing around age 5 or 6, how the brain functions continues to develop through the mid-20s. And so what's interesting about it that we've learned from neuroscience is that it's not the case that all parts of the brain are changing. It's specific ones. It's the prefrontal cortex that you've probably heard of, right? Right at the top of your brain. And that helps you with planning, with emotion regulation, with thinking about the future, with decision making. But we also know that brain regions that are responsive to reward, to learning, to emotions, those parts of the brain change too. So they're both changing and not exactly at the same rate. And so some describe adolescence as a period when the emotional and the reward systems are more engaged, maybe more excitable than the parts of the brain that are helping you think about the future. And so that's where this kind of tug comes between these brain systems. And guess what wins out? The here and now, the emotional, the let's have a good time parts of the brain.
So I know you don't have a slide presentation, but in one of your talks that I listened to, you had this wonderful diagram showing the disparate development of the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system.
Yeah.
And the fact that the limbic system is evolving at a much higher rate than the prefrontal cortex, and which causes this huge disparity.
Yeah, that's right.
Between one's emotional life and their ability to actually modulate it.
Yeah.
Can you talk about a bit about that? Because I just thought in that one diagram I learned so much about my kids.
Good, I'm glad you did. Yeah, there's this like you said, this disparity. And what's interesting is that what that means is that in emotional context or in arousing context, the prefrontal cortex are the parts of the brain that are going to help you regulate your behavior or to think about your actions and how they're going to have consequences later. Those are kind of dampened compared to the parts of the brain that are encouraging you to do the emotional or risk-taking or rewarding thing. But what's interesting about adolescence is that that's not the case all the time. It's not the case that adolescents can't control their behavior, or it's not the case that they're always kind of just emotionally driven. It really depends on the context. And one of the most arousing contexts for adolescents is the social context, not just for for all of us probably, but during adolescence, there's this natural interest in establishing social bonds. It doesn't mean that they don't care anymore about their parents or their caregivers. That's not true at all. In fact, there's recent research showing that those voices matter just as much. It's just that there's more elevation to the social context. And this is where you see the greatest disparity, that diagram you're referring to, that's when you see the greatest disparity between those lines.
Right. And talk a little, since we're talking about the structure of the brain, about the striatum and how its evolution affects the kind of reward messaging in the brain.
Yeah.
I also think that's so interesting.
Oh, I know. The striatum is my favorite part of the brain. We're not supposed to, as neuroscientists, have to have a favorite, but that's my favorite. It's my favorite because it's where we have the most dopamine neurons. So many people probably know that dopamine is often thought of like the reward neurotransmitter or the chemical that gets released when you're doing something that you find enjoyable. And not just in human adolescents, but in juveniles that are rodents or monkeys or other animals, they show more release of this transmitter, or this dopamine from the striatum when they're in a novel situation or when they're learning something new or when they're in a social interaction. And so across evolution, this greater enhancement of the dopamine system has been conserved. That means that all species show greater reward sensitivity during adolescence. Anyway, that all happens in the striatum. That's what's my favorite.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. And you alluded to it, but upbringing and familial context has a huge impact on teens' aptitude for risk-taking and the extent to which they go. Is that in any way measurable neuroscientifically, or is it something that you've simply observed behaviorally?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and the field has really moved in that direction of recognizing that we can study the adolescent brain in the laboratory using brain imaging, but typically those studies only involve the adolescent, and that's ignoring the family dynamic, the social context, and that's equally important. So more and more studies are trying to think of clever ways to incorporate the importance of the family and friends into the neuroscience studies, but mostly those are behavioral.
Yes, for sure. Mm-hmm. And let's talk about another issue that to some extent parental environment and upbringing involve sleep. And
no, I love talking about sleep.
yeah, let's talk about that for a little bit, because it's
Okay.
also such an interesting thing as a parent when you're trying to regulate your kids' lives and whatever. Can you talk about how sleep affects behavioral patterns?
Yeah. Sleep is so fascinating. So back to the baby example, as parent, I'm a parent too. As parents, we care a lot about sleep in our young infants, right? Because they're typically not sleeping or they're not in a sleep pattern or habits. But sleep is equally important in adolescence because sleep is the glue that helps you obviously get rest, but it helps you consolidate and cement information you've learned during the day from the previous day. It also helps you regulate your emotions on the subsequent day. It also helps with the tension. And so when adolescents don't get enough sleep, and by the way, this National Sleep Foundation suggests that there's a sleep epidemic among adolescents because they don't get enough sleep. Sleep when we aren't sleeping well, the brain regions that are targeted or that are suffering the most are the regions that help us regulate our emotions. And so those and the learning systems. And so when you don't get enough sleep, you're not learning as well. You're not kind of interacting with others as well. And so we sleep. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice segue to a question that somebody Ed asked here, which is on the impact of COVID and an entire year of virtual learning and screen time. Can you talk a little bit about what the impact on the teen brain has been?
Oh, yeah. So many scientists around the world mobilized quickly to get at this question. And so clearly, we're hopefully almost out of the pandemic, at least in the United States. But so it's still ongoing and the jury's still out. But data suggests that the pandemic has had interesting effects. You can imagine, it's not surprising that some adolescents have suffered more academically than others. But what's really known across all adolescents is that there's been a social cost because clearly they haven't been interacting with their peers as much. And we know that adolescents really need the social connection. Now, there's also been impacts on sleep. So coming back to what we were just talking about, that adolescents typically get up really early in the morning, most of them, to get to school because school start times have gotten earlier and earlier over successive generations. And with the pandemic, maybe one small silver lining has been that they don't need to get up an hour and a half before school starts in order to get to school. And so there are some interesting trends emerging about the impact of the pandemic on sleep patterns.
So we know that school learning times have been designed far more to suit the parents' work schedules than it has to suit children's learning schedules.
Yes.
Is there any hope that research and development in your field will actually persuade educationalists to start kids later in the day?
Try they have. A few years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a recommendation that school start time should be delayed by an hour. Now, that has had mixed effects. Some school districts have, some haven't. What happened? What are you looking at?
Oh, I'm sorry. My dog is barking his backside off. And I was hoping it wasn't going to be disrupting you. Carry on.
That's right. And so anyway, so some school districts have, and there's some data suggesting that those school districts that have delayed the school start time do see gains in academic performance. And actually what's interesting, and there's been a decrease in car accidents. So we haven't really talked about mortality in adolescents, but the number one cause of death among adolescents is car accidents. And schools that delay the start time show some evidence that has an impact on that too. So unrelated to the school, but more related to the fact that the kids get more sleep.
Well, and again, talking about adolescent mortality, teen suicide is a subject very close to me. My nephew hanged himself when he was 14.
Oh my gosh.
Bizarrely, a very close friend of mine's kid who I adored also hanged himself age 14.
Oh,
it's a serious issue, and I became quite involved in it. Can you talk a little bit about the thought process that lead to that? and how, if there are any ways as a parent or caregiver of an adolescent that you can spot the signs, help prevent them, ameliorate them.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on why it is that there's such an uptick in mental health issues or concerns as people move through puberty. And, from the neurobiology standpoint, it's very clear that it's because of the change in emotional systems, kind of what we described before, that they're inclined to positive emotions, but also negative ones as well are felt more strongly during adolescence. And I think that part of the reason this may be in terms of suicide is because there's such a, the adolescent brain is really good at thinking about the now and focusing in on the emotions experienced right now, rather than thinking about how those emotions may change in the future. And so the teen suicide rate has been linked to impulsivity, that when an adolescent takes their own life, there is an element of impulsiveness that leads to that decision. And so the warning signs, of course, are, as many may imagine, the depressive symptoms should be taken seriously. Any thoughts of injurious behavior should be really followed up on. I think it's one of the common things that my clinician colleagues advocate for is that if an adolescent is really feeling depressed or anxious, to ask them if they have thoughts of hurting themselves, because it's not the case that one's going to plant that seed by asking the question, but moreover may help them redirect that sentiment into something, another way of coping.
And moving slightly sideways from that to the sort of flip side, because there are other sort of potentially dangerous negative things we can talk about the adolescent brain. But Olivia asks, can the inclination towards risk-taking behavior also lead to them taking what we would call, with an adult judgmental frame, I suppose, good risks? For example, gaining in confidence, whether
Yes, Olivia, I love the question. Yes, that's exactly what I work on in my lab, and I'm part of the Center for the Developing Adolescent. That's really the narrative we work under, that not all risk-taking is bad risk-taking. And risk-taking, in fact, is something that, as I mentioned before, is conserved across species, and it serves a very adaptive purpose, and that is to get out into the world and to explore and to learn from new adventures. And adolescents are really good at taking the risks that as adults we're not inclined to take, learning a new language, traveling to Europe for the summer, trying out for the school play. Adolescents are really passionate leaders of causes that they believe in. They're activists. All of that is risk-taking because they're focused on the now and what moves them. And so that's the kind of risk-taking that we really want to encourage.
So, which brings me to a question that Joe asked, quite interesting, which is there any evidence that older persons' avoidance of risk or novelty is related to if the striatum, for example, is the center that involves risk and reward judgments, and dopamine is part of the sort of pleasure reward mechanism. Does the depletion of dopamine in older people mean they're less inclined to take risks or be attracted by rewards?
That's exactly right. So there's an inverted view about how the dopamine system works. So it's kind of creeping up as you become an adolescent. It peaks in adolescence and then it goes down as you become an adult. It serves a function of focusing on responsibility and kind of the adult things that we do. But it is the case that along with that depletion of the reward system, or the less sensitivity to the reward system, we are less inclined to take risks and seek out rewards. It's not to say everybody. I mean, there are some adults who, of course, are still climbing mountains and jumping out of planes and things like that. They probably have more dopamine in their system. Yeah, exactly. you do that, but I do not do that. I'm so reverse.
Very and again, I'm going to combine two questions, one from Catherine and one from Ray here, but they sort of work together. Does race, gender, ethnicity, or sexual orientation affect the development of the adolescent brain?
We don't have enough data on that. Only recently have we started to collect enough participants in a particular study to address those, those kind of granular questions. We know a little bit more about sex and gender, in that boys are more likely to take risks. We know that not even from neuroscience, we just know that from behavior. But the adolescent boy brain does seem to be more reactive than the girl brain. But in terms of ethnicity and race, like I said, we don't yet have enough research, but there are recent initiatives that collect a lot of big data. The ABCD study launched by the National Institutes of Drug Abuse is one of them. So we'll know. Well, hopefully we'll know soon.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about an issue that I know you're passionate about. As a Brit, a European, one of, to be honest, many things that appalls me about this country is that uniquely in the world, it will try adolescents as adults.
Right.
And the results are while satisfying sort of biblical need for, justice that meets the severity of the crime, the results seem absolutely appalling. There are 10,000 adolescents in adult prisons at any given moment in this country.
Yes.
From the statistics I've been reading, they're 5 times more likely to be sexually abused. They're 36 times more likely to commit suicide.
Wow.
You look at the case of 2 Wisconsin 12-year-old girls who stabbed another girl because as a homage to Slender Man. And they were 12 years old. One of them's now serving 25 years in a mental institution. One of them got 40 years in jail. It's utterly appalling to me personally that's how this works. Can you talk about what you and colleagues working in your field are doing to try and get adolescents tried as adolescents and compensation made? We adjust for mental competence,
right?
Exactly. Clearly there's a failure to understand consequence in teenage brain.
So one of the goals of adolescent neuroscience research is to inform policy and to think about how the policies that we have in this country and worldwide, really, whether or not they're developmentally appropriate. Do they take into consideration exactly what you're describing, which is how the brain works at different ages? And in the juvenile justice system is perhaps where adolescent neuroscience has had the most impact. By first, something quite simple now, it seems, that the adolescent brain is distinct from the adult brain. Now, that is something that 20, 30 years ago wasn't appreciated. It was the case that it was solely based on what the crime was. That's not to say that someone who's found guilty of doing something heinous should not be, there shouldn't be consequences. However, there should be, and adolescent neuroscience research has shown this, that there are differences in how they think about the crime or the behavior that they are doing, and that trying them as adults is actually not consistent with the notion that the adolescent brain is plastic and keeps changing. It's more likely to change than an adult brain. So a 45-year-old who commits a heinous crime is different than a 17-year-old who commits a crime. The 17-year-old more likely has committed that crime in the presence of peers, older peers, and they're more likely to be influenced by peers. They're also more likely to benefit from therapy or remediation more so than an older, more mature adult. And so it's important to take that into consideration. I will also say that in addition to the statistics that you named, youth of color are disproportionately in the juvenile justice system and more likely to be tried as adults than are non-youth of color. And so that's also a consideration that needs to be addressed.
Yes, I mean, but that's true right across the criminal justice system.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So you know, and I don't know that youth of color are more likely, are more overrepresented than people, you know, adults of color in our criminal justice system. Seems to be, unfortunately and tragically, you know, kind of a wash. What about, you know, physical and psychological abuse? You know, obviously they affect adolescents differently than adults. Are those measurable, you know, neurobiologically, those differences? Can you, for example, see in an fMRI or other kind of brain scanning jury evidence of that kind of damage in a teen brain?
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of scholars, not myself, but others who examine early life adversity. And by early life, they're referring to, you know, very early life through childhood, through adolescence. What happens to those individuals who experience the types of trauma that you're describing? And there are data to suggest that there are differences in how their brains develop. And that's simply because our brains are very resourceful. If we come across a stressor, a chronic stressor, or a trauma, our brain is quickly going to try to help us reconfigure that experience to and adapt to it, right? So for example, the consequence is that if you are experiencing chronic trauma as a child, your amygdala, the part of your brain that processes emotions, is more likely to be hypervigilant as you get older. That's adaptive across humans and other animals. But this research has also shown that although there are differences in the developmental trajectory of the brain in those individuals, it's not the case that their brain is ruined or damaged, or, you know, that they can never lead a normal life or something like that. And that's the important thing to consider, that even though the trauma does change the brain, the plasticity and the resilience of the brain is equally important to direct healthy development later on.
And so I suppose that goes to a question that Norbert asked, which is, you know, are there hardwired, in quote marks, parts of the brain that are significantly changed during teen years? But that's sort of what you've been talking about, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, the brain is malleable. You know, as we get older, it becomes less malleable. That's why it's harder to learn a language, for example, as an adult. That's why it's harder to not have an accent if you learn a second language or third language as an adult, because the brain does become more hardwired in certain parts of the brain. However, there remains enough plasticity or openness in the brain for us to be able to, you know, learn to play the guitar as you get older. It doesn't mean that you can't learn it, just may be harder to do it.
I can bear evidence to that.
I know, you love guitars. I see one right now in the background.
Yes, you do. The issue of sleep seems to be of great interest to some of our listeners, viewers, participants. You know, so in addition, Ed asked, what, in addition to good night's sleep, what are other recommended physical, mental practices to promote healthy outcomes for teens? And Andrea asked, how does sleep disordered breathing impact teens? Is routine screening a good idea? They're two separate questions, but they kind of feed into the same.
They really do, yeah. So I think one important thing is we have focused traditionally on, when we talk about sleep in anybody, but mostly in adolescents, on the duration of sleep. You know, adolescents need, the number is probably, you know, around 8 hours of sleep as recommended by the National Sleep Foundation. Well, 8 hours is a good aim, but some people need a little more, some people may need a little less, but it's equally important to keep in mind the sleep quality. Now, quality is affected by so many things. Of course, caffeine, you know, emotional distress is something that will keep people up at night, but also the really basic things of the sleep environment. Is there a lot of light in the room? What's the temperature like? Is the bedding comfortable? We recently did a study in Los Angeles where we went around and asked about bedding and did a survey, and we went into the home to find out the sleep environment of adolescents across diverse socioeconomic environments, and found that we thought those who weren't sleeping well, who were having poor sleep quality, it was because they were up at night looking at their phone. Now, the phone certainly plays a role, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we found the number one predictor of their sleep quality was actually their bedding. Did they find their pillow comfortable? Was their mattress comfortable? And we thought that was fascinating because that's easy to change. It's just a matter of paying attention, right? And as adolescents become adolescents, parents are less inclined to focus on those seemingly mundane parts of their lives that may actually have big consequences. So if you can change someone's pillow and change how they're sleeping, not only will you affect their learning at school, their ability to regulate their emotions, their mental health status, you will get them a good night's sleep. So anyway, so I think it's the whole picture that impacts sleep. Now, technology has gotten a lot of attention, of course, in the media, and interpersonally, parents tell me a lot about how their teens are addicted to the phone. The phone is bad at night for everybody, but especially adolescents, because what happens during adolescence is that, well, in everybody, we release melatonin when the sun goes down. Melatonin is a hormone that makes you feel sleepy. Adolescents just naturally release melatonin about 2.5 hours later than adults do. So their brain doesn't tell them to get sleepy until it's well past dark, unlike adults who start feeling sleepy when the sun goes down. Well, when you have a phone out, the blue wavelength light that is emitted from the phone tricks the brain into delaying that melatonin release until still later. And so when adolescents are looking at their phone before bed, their brain thinks that it's daylight outside. And so that means that the hormone that is supposed to help them get sleepy isn't getting released. And so there's just so many ways that the phone impacts their ability to sleep, the blue wavelength length. And then the last thing I'll say about it is that, as I mentioned before, emotions and being highly aroused emotionally will prevent you from sleep. Well, when teens are on their phone at night, they're often, engaged with friends. It's not calming down things that they're looking at on their phone. And so that is also going to impact their sleep.
And like somebody was asking about apneic breathing, disorder breathing. To what extent is that a problem in adolescence and a factor that as a parent one should be monitoring?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the extent of the problem, but certainly if there is concern, it should be monitored because it's not typically something that is observed in adolescents. So,
a number of these questions here, may belong to more to sort of behavioral psychiatrists or psychologists, specializing in children rather, than maybe, appropriate for your field. But, several people are asking questions. Christy says, if you notice a teen losing passion in something, when might this represent a normal process and when might it be a red flag?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that's something that's what's so fascinating about adolescence, right? There's no black and white. And I started, our conversation talking about how adolescence is really characterized by change. And so change is normal. It's normal to not want to do gymnastics anymore or want to take up the piano, right? Those things are normal. However, I think it's when an adolescent loses interest in everything, that's concerning, right? When there's lack of motivation, because one of the hallmarks of depression is not simply feelings of sadness or feeling, blue a lot. It's really just the lack of motivation. And there's one thing we know about the adolescent brain is that because of the changes in the dopamine system in the striatum, they often show a lot of motivation. And so the opposite of that is what's concerning.
Yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And Cindy asked, and it's good luck with this question. Because,
okay.
I think every parent would like to know the answers. But any strategies to help a teen who may need it, especially when they deny the problem, which again seems to be wholly characteristic of the species.
That's right.
Any advice and help to offer there?
Yeah, have someone else ask them the question. I mean, I think this is one of the things, right? That for adults too, when sometimes our caregivers or our parents are not the best person, unfortunately, to be asking those questions. And that's why outsourcing it to either a therapist or a trusted adult may generate or elicit, more forthcoming information from the adolescent. We were all that way. I was that way with I'm still that way with my parents, right? That you just
a prophet is without honor in his own land.
Exactly.
That's
parents
the problem.
don't know a thing.
Parent,
right?
you're a fool until proven otherwise.
Exactly.
So yes, indeed. And you know, you and I have talked a little bit about, you know, I'm interested to hear you as a neurobiologist sort of specializing in adolescent development in terms of how it's modulated your behavior towards your kids who are 7 and 10, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my good memory. Yeah.
And I know you said that you were already talking to your 10-year-old about, you know, sex education and things. And, you know, which is also a question that Jim asked, you know, what effect should this knowledge of teen neurology have on how we teach sex ed?
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Such a good question. I think starting the conversation early, it's uncomfortable. I mentioned, I think before, John, my husband wants nothing to do with that conversation, even with our 10-year-old, especially now with our 7-year-old daughter. But having the conversation before it's an awkward conversation is really important with anything. But sex often is number one at the top of the list of what's the conversations we may be dreading. And the reason for that is because as kids become adolescents, they just simply become more self-aware, right? There's a lot of research on self-consciousness that emerges during adolescence. You know, you're more likely to be embarrassed about certain things. So if you've already established a rapport with the adolescent with a kid before they become an adolescent, it's not only do they have the knowledge, you know, earlier, but they're more likely to come to know that the parent is not going to judge, is not going to be uncomfortable, and that's going to lead them to open up more. But also in terms of not just sex ed, but coming back to sleep, establishing healthy sleep patterns as they become adolescents, I think is really important, because parents come to me and say, well, you know, now they're 17 and he doesn't sleep until 4 a.m. What do I do? Not to say it's too late, but it would have been easier to address the problem earlier.
Right. And still on the subject of problems with teens, Dinah and Andrea both asked about, you know, adverse childhood experiences. You know, how particularly do those affect adolescent, you know, the adolescent development and brain, you know, the evolution of the adolescent brain?
Yeah. So the number one thing that's been found is that in a brain that has been traumatized or abused or experienced adverse experiences early in life is going to learn to more quickly react and try to prepare for subsequent adverse events, right? So I mentioned the amygdala of the brain, this emotion center. At its core, the amygdala is a learning center. It helps you learn about emotions, right? It helps you pair. Every time I see a bell, something bad happens. That's what the amygdala does. It helps you predict the world. And so if you either grew up in a world that is unpredictable because maybe you live with an alcoholic parent and you don't know, you know, how they're going to interact with you that day, or you live in a country where there's a lot of violence and you don't know what day you're going to experience, the amygdala is on a high alert for these individuals. And so the amygdala, in situations when they are no longer in this traumatic or violent environment, may still be in overdrive. And that's something that can be retrained, but it takes a long time for that individual. But
is the amygdala, we talked about the striatum, you know, the prefrontal cortex. Is the amygdala something that in your field, looking at it at you know, on a structural basis, that you can see differences in, you know, between adolescence and adulthood?
Yeah, what's interesting is that the amygdala actually develops very early in life. There's fascinating research by a colleague at Columbia, her name is Nim Tottenham, who does this research. What's really interesting about Nim's work is that she doesn't just focus on the amygdala, but on how the amygdala communicates with the prefrontal cortex. So it's long been thought that the prefrontal cortex helps to dampen the amygdala reaction when the reaction is too strong or inappropriate. And what Nim finds is that the connections or the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is what changes, and it is what is atypical in individuals who experience trauma early in life or something like that.
Is there any scientific evidence, and this is a question that Taryn asked, that meditation is useful for teens? I know it's useful for me. Is it particular? Does it have any particular use for teens?
It's so interesting. I just had a great conversation with a colleague yesterday about this topic. The data suggests yes, but there isn't enough of the data yet to know exactly the mechanisms by which it is useful. But any type of introspection or the space to meditate is helpful for adolescents, some more so than others. But I know there's just increasing research on the importance of this work.
Is there any evidence that meditation increases dopamine output?
Yeah, not that I know of. I think that the research I've seen from neuroscience is more about how it affects regulatory systems, how it helps you kind of quiet the mind and have better control over, whatever it is that you're trying to control.
Carla asks, how would you respond to the notion of angry young white men as perpetrators of many mass shootings?
Interesting.
Obviously there's a preponderance, and I've made a movie about serial killers. Often, they're almost invariably men and usually white, and most often young, in the younger part of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think those two issues probably interlock.
Yeah.
Can talk about that. It's really
I wish I had answers. I don't know. I mean, I think it's fascinating that the demographic is so similar, as you know from your work. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it has to do with the racial demographic or the socioeconomic demographic, but certainly I also know that these, you correct me if I'm wrong, but that individuals who commit these types of serial crimes often are lonely or have experienced trauma themselves in early childhood. And so I think that's what's really the thing to focus on.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion about the brain of the serial killer or the psychopath and, whether there's any measurable ways to discover this. It seems to be quite frightening. If you start to think about young people being brain scanned for potential, it just starts to get into serious sort of a concern, artificial intelligence concerns and things.
Exactly.
But seriously, are there, and what does your branch of the science understand about the psychopathic brain?
Yeah, I don't know much about it other than the research I've read up on examines empathy, right? So there's a lot of research examining how our brain processes empathy. And as we become adolescents, the same brain regions that help us think about the future and plan for, just make decisions and things like that. It's a brain region called the medial prefrontal cortex, also helps us take the perspective of others. And that's very tightly linked with empathy. And adolescents who are psychopaths or sociopaths have been found to have less engagement of these brain regions when they're presented with an empathy task. In other words, either they don't show the empathy, and or if they're kind of forced to show empathy towards others, the same brain regions are not engaged. So it's really interesting. And it's hard to know, is it the case that their brains just aren't naturally inclined to exhibit or behave in an empathetic way? Or is it that because they don't typically exercise empathy, that they're not kind of practicing that brain region?
So chicken and egg question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, chicken and egg problem.
And so, but do you notice these things simply in the way those regions of the brain light up in an fMRI under certain stimuli? Or can you actually see, a sort of shrinking or underdevelopment in those regions of the brain that are actually measurable?
Yeah, mostly not anatomically are there differences in the brain that I know of, but it is more so in how they function. Is it the fact that it's the same with, there's some research on individuals with autism who, when presented with the face, for example, a picture of a face in an MRI, that the face processing regions are not showing the same level of activation, as individuals without autism. So again, it's a chicken and egg. Is it because they don't typically focus in on, emotional information from the eyes, or is it that they, I don't know.
Yeah. Something that you talked about, and it really startled me, goes to a question that E asks, whoever E is. When does a person transition out of adolescence into young adulthood? And how much does your work apply to young adults? I know the answer, but it's quite startling.
You do know the answer?
Yeah.
What's the answer? I want to hear your answer.
I did my homework. No, but go on. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I want to know the answer because I have so many conversations with legal scholars and attorneys about this very question. So I recently testified in a case that I won't give the details other than to say that the question, the testimony hinged on, is an 18-year-old an adolescent or not, right? And it's such a complicated question because we can't quantify exactly when you turn into an adult, but yet we know that a 40-year-old is an adult, right? But we don't know if a 21-year-old is an adult. And that's because, again, this transition, and there's such individual differences. One person who's 21, they fully perform and act, and their brain may look like an adult, whereas another person may not. And so it's really hard to make kind of a broad generalization. But that's why I'm interested in what you know about it.
Well, no, but you said, what you said, I think was really interesting, is that areas like our prefrontal cortex are still evolving right up into our mid-20s.
Exactly. And that's what I say as a neuroscientist. But the law has operated under the 18,
Yeah, well, the law, as Charles Dickens said, is an ass. And it takes us back to the whole issue of trying children as adults.
Yes, exactly.
There are so many ways in which our laws are essentially biblical rather than rational.
Exactly. And not informed by developmental science when they were made, right? Yeah. But anyway, that goes back to the question of when do you stop developing and start aging? So that's...
Yeah. Well, yes, I'm still waiting to find out when I start aging, of course. But anyway, so Megan asks, as a mother of daughter diagnosed with OCD and general anxiety disorder, I dread her teenage years in a lot of ways. Are there ways to physically measure changes over the years, scans, for example, or any such like metrics?
Yeah, really good question. So the best way to do that is to do longitudinal research. And at UCLA, along with a colleague, I currently have a study where we're doing just that. We're measuring how the brain that is diagnosed or on the spectrum of anxiety early in adolescence, like 9, 10, 11, how it changes over time. And we don't yet have the answers to that. We're in the middle of the study. But, it's interesting to think about whether the anxious brain, whether the anxiety worsens and how that changes the brain, but also many kids who present with anxiety early in life kind of age out of it, or their anxiety decreases. So what changes are exhibited in their brain, right? What are the protective factors that help mitigate the anxiety or whatever the symptom is? So I don't know the answer to that, but yes, there are studies trying to quantify that change.
I'm going to ask a question that has a selfish component, because I'm a filmmaker and a storyteller, and there are a lot of our audience out there who are filmmakers and storytellers. And I happen to be working on a script about a 15-year-old boy who steals a poem to please his English teacher, takes the lyrics of a song, and then finds himself pursued by the angry writer of that song. What, in your experience, do filmmakers get right about adolescence, and what do you wish they would do better? Yeah,
they get right. And of course, I'm not a filmmaker, so this is just me speaking. But
no, but you're an observer of story.
Yeah, right, exactly. They get right the excitement of adolescence, the way we all felt as adolescents, whether it was a period you enjoyed or didn't enjoy, that they get right the importance of adolescence. And that's why it's so exciting to see so many storytellers focus on this period of life. I think what they get wrong or maybe fail to include is the dynamics of adolescence, right? That someone who's a brooding, characteristic adolescent isn't always the broody, moody adolescent, right? That there are ways of how the adolescent experiences the world. And so I think, it'd be great to see more, just a more dynamic representation of a single adolescent, right? That everybody's not the same, but even within ourselves, we have different aspects or attributes.
I know we're running out of time. One last question, which comes up, sort of springboards off Deborah's question. Would you change the driving age if you could? We talked about adolescent mortality. Yeah. And what about drinking and voting? Do you think what we now know about the adolescent brain should really change our laws about, when a child reaches majority,
right,
in all of those respects?
I have thought so much about the driving age, and my knee-jerk response used to be, or sometimes still is, depending on the day, is yes, that we should increase the driving age, because and we have made changes over time, right? Like now you can't have other peers in the car, and it's because we know there's a lot of research showing that adolescents are more influenced and make more risky decisions in the presence of peers. Okay, so that's great. So that's my thought, that the driving age should be changed. However, a few years ago, there was a really interesting study showing that, as I shared before, 16-year-olds have the highest rate of automobile accidents, many of them fatal. But there was a study where they changed the driving age to 18, and now that decreased the fatality rates among 16-year-olds, but increased them among 18-year-olds. So there's this experiential component to driving that is really crucial. And if we change the driving age to, for example, God forbid, 25, then the 25-year-olds would have all the accidents, right? And so it's just really something about driving and this physical skill that that does require a lot of practice early in life. So anyway, it's an unsatisfying answer, but I guess, yes, increase it, but also provide more of the scaffolding to do it right.
Yeah. Well, I've been getting the wind-up signals.
Okay.
It's really sad to me, because honestly and truly, I'm not just saying it, I could go on yakking.
I know. We could always talk about adolescence.
Such a profoundly interesting and all-encompassing subject. And just thank you so much for your
Thank you. Generosity. So fun to see you always.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I think we'll hand back to Anne and Rick.
Okay.
Well, we're not the only ones that would want to let you yak for an extended period of time, because we knew this was going to be a great conversation in the chat box among us behind the scenes. We've been saying, this is great. But it does bring back for me all of the anxiety I used to have as a parent of an adolescent. I'm well past that. So now for anybody who is in the thick of it, I can just tell you, you do survive. They come out the other end, and then you can say, look, I did it. They did it. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. And Rick has a 2-year-old, so you've got a long way to go, buddy. That's all I'm going to say.
Don't I know.
But thank you all for being here. We are really always grateful for our audience joining us and asking such amazing questions. Jon did a fantastic job of funneling them through, and for being just the curious person that he is. And Adriana, of course, we thank you for being the incredible expert that you are. And so we look forward to putting another invitation in your inbox. Look for it, because we keep asking wonderful experts to join us, and we hope you will do the same as we send those invitations to you. So thank you and goodbye.
See you soon, everybody. Thanks.